Hi, I'm Elaine Chow, in for Jamie Poisson. A trial that was 7 years in the making came to its conclusion on Thursday, with all 5 former Hockey Canada players found not guilty of sexual assault.
Justice Caricia's carefully reasoned decision represents a resounding vindication for Mr. McLeod and for his co-defendants. Justice Caricia found that the complainant's testimony was incredible and was unreliable.
We look to this case as a turning point to do more to prevent sexual violence and to make reforms to afford survivors better treatment by the justice system.
Michael McLeod, Carter Hart, Alex Formanton, Dylan Dubé, and Cal Foote were acquitted in a London, Ontario courtroom by Justice Maria Caricia. McLeod was also found not guilty of being party to a sexual assault. All 5 had pleaded not guilty. The case stemmed from an alleged hours-long sexual assault in a London hotel room of a woman known as EM. That alleged incident led to a civil suit that Hockey Canada quietly settled in 2022. News of that settlement brought on a massive reckoning for the organization as a whole, sparking a countrywide conversation about sexual assault, consent, and hockey culture. The Athletic's senior enterprise writer Dan Robson is here with me. He's been covering this trial and spent years analyzing the long history of sexual assault claims in Canadian hockey. And full disclosure, he's also our host Jamie's husband. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Elaine.
There's been a lot of interest in this trial in London, which is a big hockey town. Dozens of protesters have been showing up during the proceedings to support EM, the woman at the center of the case. Others have shown up to support the accused. They needed a second overflow room to accommodate everyone who came to hear the ruling. And I know you're talking to us from Toronto, but your colleagues were there in person today. And what's been the reaction to the decision in the courtroom and outside of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real sort of circus this morning. More people showed up than have showed up at any time during this the 2-month trial before this. There was a lot of attention at the very beginning, and sort of waned throughout. And journalists were there, and regular spectators were there. But today it was 2 overflow rooms, just completely packed. There was a lot of sighs of relief from the players and their families in the halls, and there was obviously a lot of reactions from lawyers and spectators outside in terms of the outcome, which I think to many was just sort of a not necessarily shocking, but a sort of a dramatic end to what has been an ongoing saga that's captivated Canadians for years now.
Dan, I want to talk through the ruling with you, but first, what did EM allege happened here?
So the allegations go back to London in 2018 after a Hockey Canada fundraiser gala and golf tournament event that was happening in the city at that time. And EM said she met a group of players at the bar that night, at Jack's Bar, a very popular bar in London. Went home to the hotel with one of them, Michael McLeod, consensually. And then after that, more players arrived in the room, and she said that she was sexually assaulted by multiple players at that time.
How would you describe broadly like the narrative that the defense countered with?
They took EM's claims and sort of one by one from the very beginning of that evening, from sort of the pre-drinking at her family's house to everything that happened that night leading up to the engagement with Michael McLeod, and then everything happened subsequently. They tore that apart piece by piece. She was on the stand for 9 days. 7 of those days were through cross-examination, facing 5 very high-powered defense attorney teams. And essentially every claim that she made, they found something to pull at, and it was sort of a dismantling of the claims against these players.
And I think at the heart of it, that the case that they were making, that she was a willing participant and that she had initiated much of the sexual activity.
Yeah, not just the willing participant, as you said, that she initiated. She was framed as the aggressor. She was framed as the person who was asking for all of these sexual acts to occur. The players were called boys frequently by the defense, and men by EM herself and by the Crown, which was an interesting framing of sort of how we looked at the people involved. But they were portrayed as sort of being bashful and embarrassed and unsure of what to do and shocked by the things that she was saying. Meanwhile, she talked about having sort of gaps in her memory of that night, and allowing that she may have said things that she normally would not have said, which she said was a result of excessive alcohol use, and then also of a sort of a traumatic response in which she sort of left her body in a way, and sort of left her mind, and reacted to what she said the players were encouraging her and forcing her to take part in.
Let's go through the judge's decision, which was quite lengthy, her analysis. And what parts of EM's testimony was the judge not convinced by?
I mean, there wasn't much that she was convinced by, to be honest, from the start of her ruling, which took the majority of a day in court. As she read out the facts, she said that, from the very beginning, she said she did not find EM to be credible or reliable as a witness. She went through the events at the bar leading up to the engagement at the hotel and what happened there, and took the previous claims that EM had made about players surrounding her and buying her alcohol and sort of forcing her to drink, and video evidence that had been presented in court created a different narrative in that sense. There was incidents where she talked about the players grabbing her hand and trying to place it on their crotches, and the only video evidence of that from Jack's bar was of her voluntarily doing something similar. And so from the very beginning, she looked at all the things that have been said by EM in her testimony and in her past claims, and said that there was so many gaps and inconsistencies that she was not credible. One of the specific areas she looked at too was the alcohol consumption of that night, and video showed her, by the judge's assessments, sort of being steady on her feet throughout the night and not showing visible signs of intoxication. The defense went to great lengths to suggest that EM had consumed less alcohol than she presented in terms of her claims. And Justice Croatia agreed with that assessment.
At one point, she also, mentioned in her analysis that EM also told the court that the men likely wouldn't have physically stopped her from leaving. She made note of EM's use of the term like her truth versus the truth. There was also, some testimony from EM during the trial that put context around those decisions, and including why she didn't leave. And what did she say about her reasoning on that night? And what was the judge's view on it?
Well, she felt that from the start that she was scared and afraid after having a consensual sexual encounter. More men arrived in the hotel room and began egging her on and sort of saying, do this and do that. They laid a bed sheet down by her claim and asked her to perform all sorts of sexual acts. And she went to a state of saying that she had immense amount of fear at that time. And her reactions were based on that fear and not feeling that she could leave in that moment. And so those claims were sort of dismissed by Justice Croatia. She said that she didn't buy the idea that EM was afraid that night, that she felt intimidated. She felt that though the multiple claims from the players in the rooms identifying what EM had said and how she was acting and acts that she was doing did not align with this idea that the EM was afraid, and that somehow vitiated consent.
Speaking of consent, Judge Caracia also spoke about the two consent videos that were presented as evidence during the trial. And Dan, could you briefly remind us of what those were?
Yeah, there are two videos that were taken, both by Michael McLeod, and they're taken at different times during those early hours of June 19th, when these incidents were taking place. And in both cases, I guess EM is saying that she's asked, is this consensual? And she's saying what happened was consensual. And she's sort of agreeing with what is being asked of her. And those were presented in court multiple times. One of those, the final one video is taken at around 4:30 in the morning, and it's said to have been taken after this sort of final engagement with McLeod and before she left for the night. And in it, the Crown pointed out you can hear him saying, say it and what else. And she said that at first she said she didn't remember having those videos taken, but then she also said that she recalled him sort of hounding her to say these things, and that discrepancy was problematic for Justice Crocia in terms of her assessment of her credibility, in terms of sort of that inconsistency between the memory of what occurred, and that was something that was brought up as well. But also the assessment of Justice Crocia was that she did not appear intoxicated in those videos. There was no sign that there was like a difficulty speaking. There was no slurring of words. She spoke coherently in those videos. On the face of them, whether or not they're actual indications of consent, what they were used for is a visual of sort of her state at that time and how she was acting. You can't give consent after a fact. Consent has to be continuous to each and every separate act that occurs during a sexual encounter in Canadian law. But the assessment of the evidence presented through them was that she was she wasn't drinking, and she had her own assessment of those videos. Memory of those videos was part of the gaps in her memory.
After the trial, EM's lawyer said that her treatment on the stand, the cross-examination,
at times was insulting, unfair, mocking, and disrespectful.
could you flesh that out for me a bit?
I think it was very evident throughout the cross-examination of EM that there was a very clear contempt for and disbelief in her statements from the very beginning. And so one of the things that I kind of found somewhat shocking at the time, it was a jury trial, and the defense didn't sort of present this sort of with kid gloves. I mean, they went right at her. They from the very beginning, they accused her of wanting a wild night. At one point, one of the defense attorneys sort of gave her this idea of this sort of alter ego, in which he noted that Funny M, he called her, he used her real name in that sense, and went sort of each event of like that evening, like, oh, when she's Funny M, she does this and she does this and she does this, and there was a sort of a taunting cadence to the way that played out. The reality in the situation is that EM was on the stand, as I mentioned, for 7 days, and through that time, she's not able to consult with anybody, with her own lawyer, her counselor, with the Crown themselves. She's considered a witness at that time who's in the middle of her testimony and cross-examination, and she can't have any consultation with anyone. So there was this feeling of this sort of breaking down of EM. A one day court adjourned early because she broke down in tears, and then the next day she came back. You could tell she felt somewhat combative and was sort of ready to, as she mentioned, sort of speak her truth, which is something she was also criticized for in that sense.
Let's move on to what convinced the judge about the testimony and evidence that the players as lawyers presented. And she spoke about the group chats in particular that came after the alleged incident. Tell me a little bit more about that.
A week after the incident on June 18th, the players learned that Hockey Canada was investigating what had occurred, and this comes a great deal of shock and concern to them. There was sort of this the day after everything had happened. EM's mother had gone to police, and Michael McLeod had learned about sort of police involvement. He had pushed her to, he said, sort of make this go away. This is not a true statement. That engagement was going on between them. But when Hockey Canada learned about it and they said they were going to investigate what happened, the players that had been in the room that night got together on a group chat and started discussing sort of what to do or what had happened. And it's interesting. The Crown framed what they were discussing in terms of saying, like, we had consent, and the way they were chatting back and forth about sort of what should we do next as evidence of a collusion, an effort to get their story straight. And the defense tried to frame those same conversations as scared young boys who who saw their careers in jeopardy and saw sort of a shocking response to something that they believed was entirely consensual, and this sort of came out of left field for them, and they saw that back and forth of the players, or they argued the back and forth of that players was a very human reaction to that kind of a threat. But Justice Karushia did not view it that way. She agreed with the defense's assessment that those reactions were just the players that had been involved discussing what they saw and having a very honest conversation about it.
Yeah, I think her exact words were that they were recounting their recollections.
Yes.
I should also point out that the judge also said that it was not up to her to look at the quote, morality or propriety of the conduct of any of the persons involved in the events. I thought it was notable that she made that very explicit.
Yeah, and I think that I kind of expected her to say something like that, and it's true. I mean, the objective of the court is to determine whether, beyond a reasonable doubt, these allegations have been proven, and it's up to the Crown to prove those allegations. And in this case, there's obviously a very high bar to prove sexual assault, and in a high-profile case like this, where there's obviously lots of commentary, there's a entire beloved sport in this country that is sort of being looked at under a new microscope and has been looked at under a microscope for years for good reason. This ends up being a conversation about morality at the same time as the question of the law. And so for 2 months, as this played out in headlines and in news stories, this very serious conversation about, I guess, very exact conversation about law, about what the definition of consent is and how do we determine, what sexual assault is specifically, also gets tied up in public commentary about like what is sort of right and wrong, what people have been doing in that room. And anybody that followed this case had these conversations, in bars or with coworkers or in elevators when they sort of had an assessment about, who was right and who was wrong. Justice Garcia addressed that, obviously knowing, I think, part of the high profile nature of this case. And, she doesn't have to assess whether any of the players in that room were upstanding citizens that night, for example. That's not what the question is. The question is whether they committed a very serious offense, and she found that they did not. And that's the only question that was being addressed in each of the defendants' cases.
Dan, many of the lawyers for the defendants talked about like the impact on the accused here in light of the ruling, and what did we hear on that front? This was something that they actually spoke about during the trial as well.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the trial, there was, the defense lawyer attorneys, commented on sort of media coverage and the sort of unfair assumption of guilt before, any trying of the facts, and there was this sort of look at these players who had, had established careers or were, well in their way in the middle of this sort of dream that they had spent their entire lives pursuing, and all of that was put on pause and derailed. And in the life of a professional athlete, I mean, that's significant. I mean, to not be able to uh, continue your trade at 27 years old is very detrimental to your ability to do that in the future, and then to sort of working in the sort of prime of your career. And so this notion of this hardship that they were enduring throughout this was prominent throughout. And for those players, and for, from their defense attorneys' perspectives, this is sort of the beginning of finally putting this behind them.
You and your colleagues have reported on the history of accusations of sexual misconduct by junior hockey teams. Oftentimes a group of players with one young woman, the lack of criminal convictions or serious sentences when a conviction is reached. And thinking about all of those stories now, and also today's ruling, how does today's ruling fit into that history for you?
I mean, that's such an interesting question. I think it's a question that we'll be struggling with for some time as we sort of step away from this trial and the outcome, and sort of where everything falls afterwards. But as you mentioned, looking back, Katie Strang and I at the Athletic have gone back through multiple decades of previous allegations, and it's very rare in which you have hockey players involved in allegations and by a single female complainant, and that there is a conviction. There's sort of this repetitive nature to these claims that you could just look through by searching the news from the past. So young men elevated to high positions in communities where they're esteemed and viewed as sort of local heroes. And in this case, in particular, you have the highest sort of level of junior hockey player. You have the world junior team. So this is like the best of the best when it comes to our national games, young stars, the future of the sport. And so when we have those allegations coming against players like that, and then we have these past allegations against players of similar status. I mean, it frequently comes into question of like what's happening here. In the past, it said, well, these players are they're in the spotlight. Of course, there's going to be accusations against them because they're desired and they're sort of vulnerable to these kinds of claims. And others would say, well, actually, maybe there's more to this. Maybe there is a culture of entitlement and misogyny that's inherent within the sport, especially at a high level. And I mean, anybody who's played the sport at a high level, anyone who's been in locker rooms across this country knows that exists. I mean, if you'd say it doesn't exist, where you're just putting your head in the sand and not really addressing sort of a root of a wider problem. And the question that comes next for this is, this outcome is rested. I mean, the court has decided that there was no criminal guilt here, and that that is sort of a separate to the further questions that can be had about how these incidents continue to occur, because these incidents did happen, and even by the player's own accounting of what happened that night, without EM's version of what happened that night. I think it's fair to say that what happened, I think anybody would say, like any parents, coaches, the players themselves might sort of look back and say, like, obviously, very, very bad decisions were made there. And so I think when we step back from the news of what happened with this trial, I think there is a wider conversation that needs to be happened about how this incident happened, but also how all of these past incidents have happened. I'm interested in knowing whether or not this high-profile case, this one that sort of created a national crisis where we're talking about it in Parliament, and Justin Trudeau is, talking about it and sort of making international headlines, whether that's enough for real change. Because obviously in the past decades, as these allegations have emerged in different settings, they continue to persist.
Dan, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
That's all for today. Front Burner was produced this week by Matthew Amha, Ali Janes, Joyita Shingupta, Mackenzie Cameron, Matt Muse, Lauren Donnelly, and myself. Our YouTube producer is John Lee. Music is by Joseph Shabason. Our executive producer is Nick McCabe-Locos. I'm Elaine Chow, filling in for Jamie Poisson. Talk to you Monday.